Welcome back to the garage where we're continuing work on Project Unintended Spending, the 1987 Audi 5000 CS Quattro Turbo that I recently bought that is full of hard to fix kind of issues. In this video, we're going to be replacing the fuel injectors along with a few other parts while we're in there. If you're just now joining the series, be sure to check the link in the description below for the playlist that shows how we ended up here. Just a quick recap on why we're replacing the fuel injectors on this car, and the reason is I replaced a bunch of other fuel system components such as the fuel pump, the fuel accumulator, and I'm still getting very lengthy cold starts and even hot starts. It's really not dependent on the temperature at all. It's pretty random, honestly. And I believe the final culprit, or at least the most common culprit remaining, are the fuel injectors. We may have one or more leaking fuel injectors that are basically depressurizing the entire system. So when you go to start the car back up, a few cylinders either don't have enough fuel to really run properly, or the entire fuel system is depleted of pressure. Therefore, you have to crank it for a long time for that pressure to build back up in the system. The secondary issue is that when you first start it up, you get really rough running until what seems like all of the fuel lines get pressurized, and then all of a sudden it runs smooth as butter. So I'm thinking that's also an indicator that we've got at least one leaky fuel injector. Now, to get to the fuel injectors on this particular engine, you do have to remove a bunch of components. Looks like we're gonna have to remove the cruise control system, a lot of these vacuum lines. We're gonna have to remove I believe this is a fuel injector coolant duct right here, and it's a fuel injector cooling fan, so we have to remove this assembly out of the way. We also have to remove the valve cover. Now, while I have that off, I'm going to clean it up, repaint it so it looks nice and fresh. Again, we're going to be replacing a few things while we're in here. We'll go over the parts after I've got the old fuel injectors out, so let's get started. I've removed that threaded brass insert, there's a secondary piece that I need to remove from the cylinder head, and it's called an air shroud, and it's a plastic cone basically. And the only way to get this out that I've been able to find is a little pick like this, and I've had to bend it to almost 180 degrees so it can fit down in there. And you want to try and loop the back of it and then just pry up on it. Now, to give you a better idea of what I'm looking at here, I'm going to use a borescope camera to see down inside of it. So I've gone out and bought a little borescope camera like this, and I'm going to stick it down into that injector port so we can actually see what I'm talking about. Now, this is a little bit home movies right there, but I'm pointing it at my phone because it's going through Wi-Fi, and we can see down inside the cylinder head. If we back it up a little bit here, you see that is the hole the injector came out of. Those are the threads of that brass insert. And if we go a little bit further, we can see this orangish red color, which is the plastic air shroud that the injector seals up against. And if we go a little bit further down, you can actually see the intake valve. And look how clean that is. I'm really impressed by how clean the cylinder head is on this car in general. It means the previous owners really did care about this car. If we back up, this is the part we need to remove. See, I'm getting the pick down in there. And basically we're just trying to pull back on that. See, I've already kind of cracked it a little bit. And the reason I'm pulling this out is because there's an O-ring between this plastic shroud and the cylinder head, and it is likely very degraded, and we need to replace it. I will be replacing this air shroud, so I'm not really concerned with damaging it. I just need to get it removed. Alright, so I finally got it out of there. I had to try a few different methods, including this spring puller tool, which is a much harder steel. My pick ended up breaking. This works, at least from this position. Unfortunately, this is the best clearance you're ever going to have. The other ones, I'm going to have to figure out if I can use a pick again on those spots. But this is it. It's a pain to remove. There's no doubt about that. And there's supposed to be an O-ring that seals up right along this ridge against the cylinder head. That is very much still down in there, so I'll have to use a pick to pull that out. Using the borescope again, we can see the remains of that O-ring. And there's hardly anything resembling an O-ring still. That is technically an O-ring, but it's more like very thin plastic that definitely does not seal. Alright, quick update time. So first of all, I've been able to pull 3 of those plastic insulator cones out of the first 3 cylinders, and I'm having one heck of a time trying to pull it out of the rear 2. But what I have begun to accept is that there's no way I'm going to be able to complete this job without removing the intake manifold. Why is that? Well, first of all, this is what the cones are looking like as I pull them out. There are chunks of plastic that are ending up in the cylinder head, so I have to fish that stuff out. And you can't do that unless this is out of the way and you have access to the intake ports. Second of all, my pick that I was trying to pull these cones out with has broken off into the 3rd cylinder, and I'm going to have to retrieve it. Clearly, you don't want to start the engine with a piece of metal floating around in there. One other thing I want to mention here is you shouldn't try to take on this job without expecting to remove this. Also, this is not a job for the faint of heart. I am struggling big time with this, and I have most of the tools I thought I could ever need, and I've even had to make one just to pull these cones out. The spring puller tool that I've had, I had to shorten up pull out probably about, what is that, 2 inches of length just so I can fit it where the intake manifold is. And I've had to weld it up here on the T-handle to strengthen it up because I've broken this tool 2 times already. I just can't believe how tight those little pieces of plastic are in the cylinder head. Everything I've read on these has said, oh, you can just kind of wiggle them out of there. There is no chance of doing that. I don't know if this engine's got hot and it's kind of melted those pieces of plastic to the cylinder head, but it's simply not the case in my situation. I am having to forcefully remove them, and there's just not a lot of space to get good purchase on them. Not to mention, there's no prescribed tool to better do this. You have to make it up as you go. So I'm not going to fight those rear 2 cones yet. I'm going to try and remove this intake manifold. Unfortunately, what that means is I will have to special order an intake manifold gasket, so this is not getting back together today or even this weekend. That is just the story when working on one of these older Audis. Local parts stores simply don't have the parts. Your best option is online somewhere, and the best case scenario is getting that part within a week of ordering it. So I'm just going to keep trucking on here, at least get it to a point where I can put it back together. And here is the reason why I needed to remove the intake manifold. There's all these chunks in here from those cones, and you can see quite a lot of things. That is not something you want the engine to ingest. There's all kinds of that debris throughout here. Here is the part of the pick that broke off. I found the right combination of tools. So it's this spring puller hook and then a slide pull hammer. I can just hook the slide pull hammer like this into that. I can hook the back of that cup, and it actually works out pretty good. It's all about figuring out the correct procedure. It took me probably 30 minutes total of working on one of these, and I got that one out in about 5 seconds. So, with minimal damage too. So really it looks like removing the intake manifold, getting a spring puller like this and a slide pull hammer, and it makes this a cakewalk suddenly. There you go. Alright, so I finally have everything removed, and what a bear that was. It took me probably at least 10 hours to get to this stage, so definitely don't expect to do this in a weekend because you're going to hit some roadblocks like I did. So let's go over all the tools I used first, and then we can look at the old parts. So first of all, to crack loose the fuel lines going into the fuel injectors, you're going to need a brake pipe style wrench like this, the 14mm end of it, and then to actually grip onto the fuel injector itself, you need a 12mm wrench. So those are actually to loosen the fuel line connection to the fuel injectors. Then I would suggest removing the intake manifold, and to do that you're going to need a 6mm kind of wobble extension like this, 6mm Allen head. And that makes it a cinch to move that out. Of course, you have to remove the air box and a couple of vacuum lines, but that's relatively straightforward. You'll need a new intake manifold gasket to seal that back up as well, so remember that. The next tool you'll need is this 1/2" Allen head socket. Service manual recommends a 13mm, but 13mm cross references with 1/2", so this is what was available locally, so I got that and it worked just fine. You also need this tool that helps pry out the fuel injectors. You saw me use this. You basically hook this in to the top of the fuel injector while the fuel line's still screwed on, and then you leverage across the top of the cylinder head, and I was using a wood block so that I wouldn't damage the camshaft or the camshaft holders, and you slip a flathead screwdriver in these slots and it pulls the injectors out. These old O-rings did not want to give up. I really had to use a ton of force to get these things out of there. Luckily, nothing was permanently damaged anywhere, but it is not a lightweight job at all. Now, another tool that I ended up using is a slide pull hammer like this to actually withdraw these plastic cups. Only with the intake manifold was I able to remove these quickly. And then I used the spring puller in conjunction with the slide pull hammer to actually hook behind the back of the cups and kind of pull it out of there. I did have to modify this so it was a bit shorter, but after the intake manifold was removed, you probably get away with not modifying this. I did have to weld the T-bit back on there because this really wasn't designed to have the kind of force I was subjecting it to hold it in there, so you may have to weld that up just to get it out. Then of course you need some fine picks like this. Do not try to use these to remove those cups. As I found out, you will break them and have to fish out the little tips that end up falling off. Lastly, the tool that I found extremely helpful is the borescope. Check the link in the description below where you can buy one of these. Really nice to hook it up through Wi-Fi on your phone. It allows you to see into places you wouldn't normally be able to see, including spark plug holes and into the intake ports of the cylinder head. This is a nice tool to have on hand if you're doing any sort of mechanic work, let alone if you're trying to do this specific job. So here are the old parts we removed. First thing we have to remove are these brass threaded inserts, and these are what the fuel injectors seal up against. The O-ring slots into a channel right here, and this is where this 1/2 inch drive is used. They're really sealed into the cylinder head with some sort of anaerobic sealant or thread lock. And then we have the old fuel injectors. I don't believe these have ever been replaced. I believe likely the O-rings had been replaced at some point, but these look like they're the original fuel injectors, and I do not doubt that they were leaking to some degree. If you can look in there, there is some debris into the spout, and I imagine that would cause it to stay open a little bit. So all of these look pretty rough. Obviously, it allowed the car to run, but I have a feeling this is our main culprit of the rough running. And then we have the plastic insulator cups. So these are like air shrouds for the injector. So when the injector goes down into the port, it seals up against this, and then it seals up against the end of this insert. This O-ring kind of seals up against the bottom there. And there's an air channel in the cylinder head, and there's this cutout in these threaded inserts, and it allows air to pass into this air shroud, and I guess it cools the injector, perhaps does something, but it's a fairly complex system, and you need to make sure all the O-rings are in good shape, or else all of this will not work and you'll get a air leak in places you can't even see. And one of those places is this O-ring that seals the air shroud to the cylinder head. If you look at all these used to be rubber O-rings, and they are hard as brittle plastic, and they have no thickness left to them. I would say this is probably the primary issue for any sort of running issues this car has. If these were supposed to keep air out, they were not doing their job anymore. And then lastly, we have the spark plugs. The previous owner installed these. They installed something that was available locally at an auto parts store, and that's rarely a good idea. Auto parts stores always try to sell these Iridium E3 style plugs. They call them like a universal best plug that you can install in a car, and it's simply not true. And yes, they fit the thread of the cylinder head, but that's about it. They were actually too short to get a good connection on the spark plug wires, so likely there was some shorting and causing running issues in these alone. So I've pulled these out. They're junk. They're going right into the trash. Now let's move on over to the new parts. I've got basically everything new that needs to be replaced, starting with a new valve cover gasket. You do have to remove the valve cover in order to pull the injectors out. So I've got a new high quality valve cover gasket there. I've got a new fuel filter, which we'll replace later in the video. Then we have brand new air shrouds. These are OEM Volkswagen Audi parts that I was able to find actually locally, surprisingly enough. Then I was able to find a new O-ring set. The only thing we'll be using from here are those air shroud O-rings. Right here, this larger one has actual thickness and it's a rubber piece, so that's good. Then we have new spark plugs, original Bosch style spark plugs. These did have to come from overseas. They're just not stocked in the United States anymore. I don't even think they're made anymore, but these are the original spec for the car, so I'm excited to get those back in. You can tell how much longer these plugs are. It's no wonder the plug wires did not fit. Look, that's a good ½ inch longer. And then the real star of the show, brand new Bosch fuel injectors. Look at these beauties. You know, originally I said, gosh, it's expensive to replace all these, but once you have them in hand, you feel their density. I mean, these are high quality parts. And they have the new O-rings on there, really for the $40 a piece that they cost. Yes, it seems like a lot, but man, it's going to improve running, no doubt. Look at that. Direct replacement parts, direct original replacement parts, and those are ready to go in. One part that's not shown here because I had to order it today, I do have it on expedited shipping, but it won't be here for a couple days, is a new intake manifold gasket. It's a good idea to always replace those because they are a crush style gasket. You don't want to try and reuse an old one, or else you may have air leaks and you'll be wondering where they came from. So those will be here, but this reassembly is going to take me a couple days anyways, so that'll be okay. And the last thing I want to touch on are all the parts that I pulled off, the durable parts that will be going back on, such as the valve cover here. It looks pretty rough. All the original paint has kind of fallen off. So what I'm going to do with some of the downtime that I have is clean this up and repaint it a nice black. That's what it would have been originally. I'm not a big fan of trying to make things look flashy, like painting them red or anything like that. I think that always looks a little bit goofy. But I am trying to make it look original, which is a black paint. And yeah, we'll get that degreased and cleaned up and looking really nice. It's really cool how it has the Audi logo and Volkswagen logo. Of course, this engine was shared among some Volkswagen products as well, so that's why it has both in there. Now, also, what we have here is the intake manifold, which could use a good cleaning. Got a lot of greasy gunk everywhere. One gasket that I'm going to try and get away with without replacing is the cold start injector gasket right here. I'm going to put a little bit of Permatex number 2 just to make sure it has a nice good seal on that. There's the old intake manifold gasket. And then I'll probably clean up this charge pipe right there and clean up all the ancillary parts that I pulled off. There's the old valve cover gasket and valve cover brackets. With the intake manifold removed, you get a great view of the exhaust manifold and the turbocharger components. So you can see the turbocharger is mounted right up front here, and the manifold is this pretty complex weaving of tubes that feed into it right here. You can see if we move back here, we can see the wastegate, which is an old style wastegate that is not part of the turbocharger housing itself. This is what releases exhaust pressure when the intake side reaches a certain boost PSI. Cool setup. Here's your oxygen sensor. Here's your oil feed lines to the turbocharger. You can see the cylinder head is very clean inside. This just shows that this car has had caring previous owners who changed the oil consistently and regularly. I'm actually surprised how free-flowing the exhaust system is. Usually on these systems you see some really hard corners that inhibit good gas flow, but this is actually a pretty smooth piping. Then here is a wastegate heat shield. I'll pull this off and spray it with some fresh paint as well so it looks a little nicer in this engine bay. All right, let's get to cleaning and refinishing. Alright, so a couple days has passed now, and guess what I have now? The new intake gasket. I was able to get an L-Ring 1 shipped to me in about 2 days, and that is now meaning I can put this engine back together. That is the final piece. But in this downtime, I've taken some time to clean up these various ancillary components, such as this charge pipe. Just hit it with some nice black paint. I cleaned up these threaded inserts so they're nice shiny brass color once again. Then I shot some new high temp paint on that exhaust manifold heat shield. And then finally the valve cover I hit with some nice black paint and did a little bit of touching up in silver on the logos there. So that'll look good once it's all put back together, look a little bit like OEM once again. The final thing I spent some time cleaning up were all of the pieces pulled out of the intake ports here, all of those plastic pieces and bits of O-ring that had fallen down in there. Used an air compressor, made sure the valves were closed, and then shot some air in there and blew out all of the debris. I've also spent some time cleaning up where the O-rings seat inside of here with some Scotch-Brite and some brake parts cleaner. And we should be good to seat the new O-rings, and everything should thread back into place as we expect it to. All right, let's start putting everything back together. And with that, everything is put back together, and it went together pretty nicely and looks so much cleaner in this engine bay, especially with that painted valve cover and all of the ancillary components cleaned up and degreased. And look, we've got the proper spark plug in there so the wires aren't just kind of like loosely hanging on there. I don't even know how the previous spark plugs were working with how loose these were fitting on there. And then we've got our new injectors sitting in there. This is nicely painted, so this engine bay looks very freshened up. Now all that remains is to see if this thing not only starts but runs better. So let's give it a shot. There we are. I have to say this thing runs a lot smoother, and when I turn it on, it doesn't do that stuttering in that first 15 seconds. It feels like the injectors are all firing at once and have the same fuel pressure, so I can already tell a massive improvement already. But the real question is, does it start up easily after it's been sitting for a while? So I've let this cool for about 20-25 minutes. Let's start it up and see if it catches immediately. Oh yeah! I hate to jinx myself, but I think I fixed it. I think it was the injectors all along. Gosh, that revs out so smoothly, comes down to a nice even idle. Immediately, right when you start it up, there's no lumpiness that it has to resolve, it's just right into a good idle. So it's a coincidence that this job coincided with me getting new tires. You notice the car's up in the air and the wheels are off. That's because I just put on some brand new BF Goodrich rubber, and these tires are a massive improvement over the dry cracked winter tires that were on there before. Also spent the time and cleaned up the inside of the wheel because there was a ton of dirt and grease that was built up on there, brake dust that was built up on there. So now the car is going to ride so much better as well. It's sort of a uncommon tire size, this 205/60 R15. The tires that were on there before were actually a bit undersized, but these are the proper original size that would have come on this car. These are a nice deep tread tire. Should improve the ride quality and handling, and hopefully remove some of that pushing that the front end does. The other tires, it just felt like they were folding over and weren't gripping. So these tires should improve that no end. And that's all I've got for this video. We've taken care of one of the big issues I had with this car back when I bought it, and that was the laborious long starts that led to a very rough idle in the beginning. Now that's crossed off the list. That leaves one more big issue with this car, and that is the handbrake still not working very well. And that'll be the topic of the next video. We will permanently and properly fix this for good. So as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all again next time.